The cameras were rolling when it happened. David Letterman was mid-laugh, Tom Hanks was telling another perfect anecdote about marriage, and somewhere in the dim edges of the Late Show studio, a wedding ring fell to the floor with the softest clink that somehow echoed louder than applause. In 33 years of hosting television, David had heard every sound a studio could make. The squeak of sneakers on polished floors, the rustle of cue cards, the whispered prayers of nervous guests, the collective intake of breath from an audience about to laugh. But this sound was different. This sound carried weight that had nothing to do with gold and everything to do with the human heart. Nobody should have heard it. The audience was laughing at Tom's story about buying groceries with his wife. Something about Rita insisting they needed 17 different types of pasta because you never know what mood dinner will be in. The band was quietly tuning between segments, Paul Schaffer adjusting his keyboard with the precision of a man who'd accompanied 10,000 jokes. The usual controlled chaos of late-night television filled every corner of the Ed Sullivan Theater, from the lighting booth where technicians monitored every shadow to the green room where tomorrow's guests were already pacing nervously. But David heard it. Maybe because he'd spent 3 decades listening for the unexpected moments that made television transcend entertainment and become something closer to ministry. Maybe because some sounds carry more weight than others. Maybe because at 68 years old he'd learned to recognize the music of human frailty when it played in his theater. The ring belonged to Helen Morrison, 75 years old, wearing the same pale blue cleaning uniform she'd worn for 8 years at CBS. The uniform had her name embroidered in small, practical letters over the left pocket, a detail most people never noticed, which was exactly how Helen preferred it. She'd spent most of her adult life being invisible, and she'd gotten good at it. She wasn't supposed to be there during taping. CBS had strict policies about cleaning staff staying clear during the live broadcasts. But the night janitor, a young man named Miguel who always asked about her grandchildren, had called in sick with the flu, and Helen had volunteered to stay late. She needed the overtime pay. Harold's medical bills were still arriving 6 months after he'd stopped needing medicine. She'd been quietly emptying trash cans along the back wall, moving with the efficiency of someone who'd learned to clean around important people without disturbing their important conversations. 8 years of working in television had taught her the rhythm of the business, when to be invisible, when to make herself smaller than small, when to pretend she wasn't hearing things that weren't meant for her ears. But when Tom Hanks said the words that stopped her cold, Helen Morrison forgot everything. She'd learned about being invisible. Real love means choosing the same person every day, Tom was saying, his voice carrying that familiar warmth that had made America trust him for decades. He was leaning forward slightly in his chair the way he did when he wanted to share something that mattered, something beyond the scripted pleasantries of celebrity interviews. Even when they leave their coffee cup in the sink, even when they snore like a freight train, even when they're not perfect, especially when they're not perfect. The studio audience chuckled appreciatively, the kind of knowing laughter that comes from recognition, from people who'd lived long enough to understand that real love isn't the airbrushed version they put in movies. David nodded, ready with his next question. Probably something clever about Tom's latest film, or maybe a callback to one of his earlier stories, but Helen Morrison, standing 30 feet away with a garbage bag in one hand and a spray bottle of disinfectant in the other, felt something crack inside her chest. Her fingers, the ones that had worn a wedding ring for 52 years and 3 days, began to tremble. Not from age, though her hands had grown shakier since Harold died. Not from the cold, though the studio was always kept at an uncomfortable temperature for the cameras. She was trembling because Tom Hanks had just described her entire marriage in 2 sentences, and the weight of recognition was almost too much to bear. The ring had been loose lately. Too loose. She'd lost weight since Harold died 6 months ago. Food didn't taste like anything anymore, and everything felt empty. The house echoed when she walked through it. The bed felt vast and cold, but she couldn't bring herself to resize the ring. The thought of walking into some jewelry store, of watching them cut into the thin gold band that Harold had saved 3 months of grocery money to buy in 1971, it felt like betrayal, like admitting that this was her life now, this diminished version of herself. Harold had proposed with that ring on a Tuesday evening in November, after dinner at their usual diner. Nothing fancy, nothing dramatic, just, "Helen, I think we should get married. What do you think?" And she'd thought, yes, yes, absolutely yes. He'd slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that smelled like motor oil and safety, and she'd never taken it off. Not once. Not for surgery or childbirth or the 1,000 small emergencies of 5 decades together. As Tom continued talking about the beauty of long marriage, Helen's hands shook harder. The wedding ring, worn smooth by half a century of dishwashing and hand-holding and worry-wringing, slipped from her finger and hit the studio floor. The sound was tiny, insignificant, the kind of sound that gets swallowed by bigger noises in normal circumstances, but David Letterman's head turned like he'd heard thunder, like he'd been struck by lightning, like the universe had just whispered his name. This was the man who'd interviewed presidents and comedians, movie stars and musicians, who'd made small talk with the biggest personalities in the world and never missed a beat. But something about this moment, about the quality of that small sound, and the sudden stillness of the woman in the pale blue uniform reached through 33 years of professional instincts and grabbed him by the heart. Tom was still talking, building toward what was clearly going to be a touching conclusion about the secret to lasting marriage. And after 26 years, Rita still surprises me every day. That's the real magic, you know? Not the honeymoon phase, but the everyday choosing. The decision to keep finding each other interesting, to keep being curious about the person sleeping next to you. The audience was with him, nodding along, some of them thinking about their own marriages, their own daily choices to love or not love, to see or not see, to stay or not stay. It was good television, the kind of honest human moment that reminded people why they watched late-night talk shows in the first place. David's eyes found Helen immediately. She was crouched down, frantically searching the dark floor, her uniform sleeves rolled up to reveal arms that looked too thin, too fragile. Stage lights caught the glint of gold somewhere near her feet, but she couldn't seem to locate it. Her movements were urgent, almost panicked, like she was looking for something infinitely more valuable than jewelry, which she was. Tom noticed David's distraction and followed his gaze. The camera operators, trained to capture every moment, swung their lenses toward the back of the studio. The audience, sensing something unscripted, began to turn in their seats. "Excuse me," David said suddenly, his voice cutting through Tom's story, not to Tom, but to Helen. "Ma'am, are you okay back there?" Helen froze. 300 pairs of eyes found her instantly. The woman who had spent 8 years being invisible, cleaning around celebrities and staying out of frame, was suddenly the center of attention on national television. "I'm sorry," she whispered, but her voice was too quiet for the microphones. "I'm so sorry. I dropped my—" David stood up from behind his desk. This wasn't part of the show. This wasn't planned or scripted or approved by producers. But David Letterman had built a career on following his instincts, and right now every instinct told him that something more important than entertainment was happening in his studio. "Hold on," David said, walking down from the stage platform. "What did you drop?" Tom Hanks, who had been frozen mid-gesture, slowly lowered his hands. He'd been in enough unscripted moments to recognize when life interrupted performance. The studio fell completely silent. Helen looked up at David approaching her, then at Tom watching from his chair, then at the cameras that were broadcasting her private moment of panic to millions of strangers. Her face crumpled. "My wedding ring," she said, and her voice broke on the words. "I lost my wedding ring." David knelt down beside her on the studio floor. His expensive suit touching the same carpet Helen had vacuumed countless times, he began looking too, scanning the darkness for a glint of gold. "How long were you married?" David asked quietly, but his microphone caught every word. 52 years, Helen answered, still searching. "He died 6 months ago, Harold. He died. And I can't lose this too." Tom Hanks stood up from his guest chair. Slowly, carefully, he walked down from the stage and joined them on the floor. America's most beloved movie star, in his perfectly tailored suit, crouched down next to a 75-year-old cleaning lady and began searching for her wedding ring. "What did Harold do?" Tom asked gently, moving aside a cable to look underneath. "He was a mechanic," Helen said. "Fixed cars for 40 years, never made much money, but he fixed everything. Our house, our hearts when the kids broke them, everything except—" She stopped, unable to finish. "Except himself," David said softly, understanding. Helen nodded. "Cancer. Started in his lungs, went everywhere else. At the end, when he couldn't fix anything anymore, he made me promise to keep wearing this ring. He said, 'Keep wearing it, Helen, so I know where to find you.'" The silence in the studio was absolute. Not the manufactured quiet of a talk show pause, but the real silence that comes when people witness something sacred. That's when Tom Hanks saw it. A tiny glint of gold, barely visible under the edge of a stage light housing. "There," Tom said quietly, pointing. Helen crawled toward it, her movements careful despite the urgency she felt. Her knees protested against the studio floor, but she didn't care. When her fingers finally closed around the thin band, she sat back on her heels and clutched it to her chest like she was holding Harold himself. Then she began to cry. Not the polite tears of television emotion, but the deep, body-shaking sobs of someone who had almost lost the last physical piece of the person they loved most. The kind of crying that comes from the deepest places of grief, from the hollow spaces that nothing else can fill. David and Tom flanked her on either side, two men who barely knew her but understood completely that some moments transcend the boundaries between strangers. They'd both lost people. They'd both felt the panic of misplacing something irreplaceable. The cameras captured it all. The three of them sitting on the studio floor, Helen's shoulders shaking with relief, David's hand hovering near her back, Tom's face creased with empathy that only comes from understanding loss personally. Behind them, the studio audience sat in absolute silence. Not the manufactured quiet of a talk show pause, but the real silence that comes when people witness something sacred, something that reminds them of their own capacity for love and loss. "Helen," David said, and his voice was rougher than usual. "Would you mind if Tom helped you put that ring back on?" She looked up at them both, these two famous men sitting on a studio floor with her, and nodded. Tom Hanks, who had portrayed love in dozens of movies, who had made America believe in romance and commitment and the power of human connection, gently took Helen's hand. Her fingers were thin, marked by decades of work, the kind of hands that had washed dishes and changed diapers and held a dying husband's face. "Harold sounds like he was a good man," Tom said as he carefully slipped the ring back onto her finger. "The best," Helen whispered. "And he was right," Tom continued, holding her hand for just a moment longer. "Now he knows exactly where to find you." David stood up first, then helped Helen to her feet. Tom rose beside them, and for a moment, the three of them stood together in the soft glow of the stage lights while the cameras captured something unplanned and true. "Helen," David said, looking directly into her eyes, "Harold didn't just fix cars. He fixed people too. He fixed you so well that even 6 months later, you're still letting people know what real love looks like." The audience didn't applaud immediately. They were still processing what they'd witnessed. Then slowly, one person stood up. Then another. Within seconds, the entire studio was on its feet. But it wasn't the energetic applause of entertainment. It was the quiet, reverent recognition of having seen something genuine. Tom Hanks put his hand on Helen's shoulder. "Thank you," he said simply, for reminding me why I fell in love with my wife in the first place." Helen smiled through her tears. "Thank you for helping me find Harold." The ring caught the light as she twisted it gently back into place. Where it belonged. Where it had always belonged. Where Harold would always be able to find her. David walked back to his desk, but something had changed in his posture. The professional mask hadn't quite settled back into place. His audience could see it. The way his shoulders carried a different kind of weight now. Before he sat down, he turned to the camera, but not in his usual way. This wasn't David Letterman, the entertainer. This was David Letterman, the human being, speaking to other human beings about the things that matter. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his voice quieter than usual, more careful. "We'll be right back after these messages, but if you're watching at home and someone you love is sitting next to you, your husband, your wife, your kids, anybody who matters to you, maybe take their hand. Just for a second. Don't think about it. Just reach over and hold their hand, because 52 years goes by faster than you think. Hell, 52 minutes goes by faster than you think." He paused, looking directly into the camera lens as if he could see through it to the living rooms and bedrooms where people were watching, where couples were taking each other for granted. "And Helen," he added, his voice breaking slightly, "Harold knows exactly where to find you. Trust me on that one." The cameras cut to commercial, but nobody in the studio moved. The audience remained in their seats, processing what they'd witnessed. Tom Hanks stayed on stage, his hand still resting on Helen's shoulder. Helen Morrison, still wearing David's jacket over her uniform, looked down at her wedding ring, now back where it belonged. The gold caught the studio lights, the same fingers that had held Harold's hand through labor pains and birthday parties, through his mother's funeral and their daughter's wedding, through the diagnosis and the treatments, and finally those last impossible hours. She twisted the ring gently, feeling its familiar weight, its perfect imperfection after 5 decades of wear. And somewhere in the warm darkness of the studio, Harold Morrison was smiling, knowing exactly where to find his wife. The ring had found its way home, and so finally had Helen.